"The smoke is coming," she said calmly in a childlike sing-song voice. They had been walking for days. Elliot and Cleo stayed a good distance behind Evan and Nikolai. Evan was the eldest of the four. She never liked her given name, Evangeline, so people that knew her knew to call her Evan. But everyone that knew her had disappeared into the smoke. "Shut up, Cleo. The smoke has been coming ever since we started walking." "I'm sorry, I just thought you all should know that it's moving faster." Cleo turned back and caught up to Elliot, her long blonde hair flowing in the wind. She was never one to be fazed by Evan's mean words. "Well, if it's gaining speed, then we need to gain speed as well, that's all," said Elliot. "This is your fault," said Nick. "Where are we even going?" Evan stopped in her tracks. She turned around slowly for intentional dramatic effect. "Oh my god, Nick, if you ask that one more time, I'll kick you in the nads." The field of tall grass they were walking through kept tickling his ankles, and he complained about it every few meters. The four of them met 5 days ago, right after the initial attack. The smoke, made up of small twinkling lights traveling on a gray wind, came down slowly, and everyone thought it was a beautiful phenomenon, until it touched down and anything it made contact with vanished into thin air. Not only people, but entire buildings were disappearing. All that was left was a wall of gray. Evan Potestas and her brother Elliot, Cleo Clemens, and Nikolai Odiosis made it to an open field near the edge of town. Together they began walking as far away from the all-consuming grayness as possible. "Why are you all so calm about this?" asked Nick. "You know your brother is the one that caused this to happen, Evangeline." "Don't call me that, and I don't know anything. Look behind you, it's all just gray, like nothing was ever there. How could this possibly be Elliot's fault? He's only 15. No matter what he says, this was not caused by him." "You know I'm right behind you guys, right?" said Elliot. "Plus, I never said I caused this. I simply made a connection between the time I pulled the thread and the time the smoke showed up." Evan's long black hair blew into Nick's face as she turned to look at Elliot. "Honestly, Elliot, as if the pulling of a golden thread out of a magical comforter delivered to us from the gods would bring down the fury of a hungry smoke onto our land." Cleo raised her eyebrows at Evan and slowly shook her head. Evan was always so dramatic, she thought. "Yes, I know, Cleo. I was emphasizing the ridiculousness of his connection," Evan said, noticing Cleo's judgment. "But I pulled the loose thread out of my blanket at the exact time that we heard the first scream," said Elliot. As Elliot mentioned the scream, Nikolai thought back to that day. He had been sitting at his desk on his laptop when he noticed the heat. He was stressing over his English essay, his hair in disarray from the many times he would run his hands through it in frustration. His orange cat Minty was meowing behind him on top of the bunk bed he had had since he was 6. "Shut up!" he yelled, swiveling around in his chair and throwing the pillow he had behind his back at the cat he mostly despised. "When did it get so hot in here?" he asked, pulling on the t-shirt that now clung close to his body. He turned back to his work while thinking about how ridiculous it was to be talking to a cat. He was about to type the next word when the door to his small room swung open. His mom was in the doorway, out of breath. The apartment they had was very small, and all the privacy he had was in this one room. When he opened his mouth to tell his mom to get out, he was cut off by her scream and then the smoke. Evan, from her position next to Nick in the grassy field, whipped her head around faster this time, her hair once again whipping him in the face, waking him from his reverie. "Seriously, Elliot, it wasn't your stupid quilt." "Get your frickin' hair out of my face," said Nick. "It's all I've been eating lately." Elliot looked down at the handful of dead prairie dogs he'd caught. Hair wouldn't be any worse than the taste of those, he thought. "Maybe if you didn't insist on walking so close to me, you wouldn't get my hair in your mouth," Evan said. Nikolai's cheeks heated up as he looked down and coughed quietly into his hand. "It's gone again," said Cleo. She kept checking behind her to see where the smoke was. They didn't know what it was, and she was nervous it would do something unexpected. "Will you stop that, Cleo? Seriously, we don't need a play-by-play," Evan replied. Cleo lowered her eyes to the ground and started playing with the bottom of her shirt. "You know we can't keep running forever," she whispered quietly so that only Elliot heard. By the end of the day, they reached the edge of the field. It led into a forest that they all knew very well. The setting sun shone through the trees, accentuating the many freckles covering Cleo's face. She looked up at Elliot with her eyes wide. Elliot nodded, and she noticed for the first time how nice his dark brown hair looked in contrast with his light eyes. It wasn't as harsh as Evan's jet black locks. They started into the forest. Nikolai's gaze kept wandering towards Evan, and he didn't notice the tree. "Ugh!" Nick exclaimed. "What the fuck is this?" "Language!" said Elliot. "Cleo's only 12. He looked down at her next to him and smiled. "I'm 14, Cleo said quietly, while pushing her blonde hair behind her left ear. "Guys, we really need to keep moving," Elliot yelled from up ahead. What are you even doing back there? What are you doing? Where were you even taking us? Nick yelled back. Evan turned around and walked back towards Nick with her eyes so focused on his face, anything in her line of vision could be burnt by her gaze. She kicked him in the nuts, her face as blank as an unwritten story. Nikolai doubled over, letting out short breaths. His eyebrows tightened in anger, as if being pulled down by two strings, and his teeth clenched. I told you not to ask that again, she said, shrugging her shoulders, tilting her head to the side with her bottom lip slightly protruding with nonchalance. Come on, get up, let's go, said Evan, extending her hand to help him up. In spite of the situation, he took it. Cleo led them to a clearing in the forest where the leaves on the ground were flattened in a perfect circle, as if an alien spaceship had landed there moments earlier. She told them this is the spot she used to camp with her family. Evan and Elliot both used to camp in these woods as well with their parents and older brother Tate. Elliot started a fire to cook up the prairie dogs, and they all settled around it. The mixture of the smoke and the roasting of the animals made an awful smell that Cleo found familiar. Staring into the fire, the sun having fully set, she thought back to the day the smoke arrived. Cleo's little sister, Annabelle, had been playing with her dolls in the living room. Her parents were gone to a meeting with the bank, and she was in charge of making dinner for Annabelle and herself. She had done it many times before, and today she was going to make chicken and rice. It was her sister's favorite meal, and her mom never thought to make it. The rice had been cooking in the rice cooker for a bit, and she was now going to put the chicken in a skillet. She picked the slimy, uncooked chicken up and placed it in the hot pan. While she was wiping her hands off on a towel, Annabelle attempted to put one of the Barbie shoes in her mouth. Rushing to make sure her sister didn't choke, Cleo threw the towel down quickly. She took the Barbie shoe out of Annabelle's hand and took the other shoe off the Barbie for good measure. Then she smelt smoke and her eyes began to water. Cleo rapidly turned to look at the chicken. The chicken wasn't burning, but the towel she threw down had caught fire. Cleo rushed back over to turn the stove off and then find the apartment's fire extinguisher, but when she got to the stove, she heard a pop and felt the burning of the sun in her face. The very next second, her face cooled down and she opened her eyes to see the stove had disappeared and all the rooms behind the kitchen were gone. All she saw was gray and a smoky substance filled the air. She heard Annabelle from behind her. Cleo? Cleo? The gray smoke was approaching her sister. Cleo? Her sister said, looking down at her Ken doll that she was making talk to the female Barbie, whom she had named Cleo. Cleo! Elliot said for the fourth time, thrusting some meat forward. Cleo looked away from the fire and up at Elliot, holding the unappetizing slice of charred animal. Cleo shook her head and said no thank you. Elliot sat down next to her with his portion of prairie dog and began biting into it like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "Aw, Elliot, that's gross," said Evan. She picked up a handful of leaves at her foot and tossed them into Elliot's face. Nikolai was sitting cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire. His eyes widened, and Evan turned her head to see what he was looking at behind them. The smoke was back and was consuming the trees, leaves, dirt, and everything that was swept in its shiny cloud. "It's advancing at a slower pace than before," Cleo told them. "We should be okay here for tonight, but should get moving early in the morning." She scooched her bum forward on the log Nikolai had laid down when they got there and took out the mini notepad she always kept in her back pocket. "What are you always writing in that thing?" asked Elliot, leaning over her shoulder to take a look. Cleo turned her head to look at him as she replied, but she didn't realize how close his face was. She quickly looked back down at her pen. "Recording its appearances and patterns for the scientists if we ever get out of here," she said. Evan chuckled to herself and looked up at Nick. Nick was looking back at her with a knowing smirk. They had both caught a glimpse of it when she dropped it that morning, and the wind made it hop forward on the ground. There was a page with a large heart with Elliot's name inside of it. A few hours later, Evan told Nick they should probably put out the fire and get some shut-eye. He wagged his eyebrows at her, sauntered over to the dying flames, and unzipped his pants to pee on the remaining twigs. Cleo and Elliot were already asleep. "A little warning maybe before you whip it out," said Evan. Nikolai zipped up his pants and made himself a pillow of fallen leaves. "You're just jealous you can't pee standing up," he replied. Evan made her own leaf pile and laid down near him. She told him she only chose that spot to keep an eye on her brother. As her eyes began to feel like 10 tons of cement, she thought of her brother Tate. Evan and Elliot had been at Tate's apartment visiting for the summer. Their older brother had moved out of their house May of the last year. All three siblings were very close, and this was the first time he'd had them over without their parents buzzing around like no vacancy signs. Tate was going out to buy some milk because Elliot drank it all. He picked up his keys from the decorative bowl by the door and jiggled the door handle. "There's a specific way you have to turn it to get it open. I should get it fixed," he said. "Make yourselves at home. Try not to drink all of the orange juice too while I'm gone, El." Elliot put his hand to his forehead, saluted to his brother, and gave him a curt nod. Tate nodded back and turned to Evan and nodded. "I'm not doing that, just get us milk," Evan said while laughing him off. Tate left and Evan sat down with her brother on the couch. "I can't believe you drank all the milk, we just got here." "What can I say, I'm a growing boy," said Elliot with a cheeky smile. He got up and told her he was going to set up his bed. Through the doorway, she saw him spreading out his blanket when they heard a scream from another apartment. Elliot walked out of his room and pointed towards the door, a questioning look on his face. Evan nodded, just as confused, and they both walked towards it. Evan tried the handle, but neither of them really knew how to jiggle it the right way. Elliot noticed an odd smell in the air, and suddenly the back half of the apartment was covered in the smoke. There was nothing there. Elliot's made bed was no longer where he had made it. Evan woke up without being able to breathe. She felt like she couldn't get enough air in her lungs, like there was a heavy weight on her chest. She looked down to see that Nick moved closer in the night and used her as his pillow. "Get off me," she grumbled through her teeth as she lifted his head and pushed it to the dirt. "Ow! Was that necessary?" "Shit, guys, look, the smoke is deeper into the forest, we've got to move," said Evan. She moved towards Elliot and Cleo and gave them little nudges to wake them up. They both looked confused. Nick just pointed towards the smoke and they both jumped up and knew what was going on. They started running deeper into the forest, staying close together. "How do you know where to go?" Nikolai asked while breathing heavily. "I don't. I just know we have to keep moving away from that," she replied, pointing her chin briefly behind her. They reached the other side of the forest, but there was no real way out. The edge of the tree line was right next to a rock face. Evan worked her way to the right and brought them to an opening in the rock. Nikolai recognized the cave as the place he used to explore when he was 10, with his friend Thomas. Before he moved in with his mom, he lived next to Cross Pike Mountain with his dad. He didn't realize those were the woods they were in. When they reached the back of the dark cave, Cleo turned back to face the entrance. There was no more sunlight shining through. There were no more woods. In that moment, they realized there was no escape. Evan took Elliot's hand and shut her eyes tightly. Cleo reached into her back pocket, but not the one with the notepad. She took out 2 tiny shoes and sat on the ground. She kissed them in the palm of her hand and closed her fists tightly around them. Curious, Nikolai walked forward. He had nothing to lose. Elliot was watching as Nick walked right up to the cave entrance. He stopped for a second, took a deep breath, and placed one foot forward into the sparkling gray lights. His leg was still there. He walked forward some more, and nothing vanished. He looked back at Elliot to see whether he could be seen, and Elliot was nodding very slowly, with his mouth hanging open. But then the cave was gone. Time passed, and Evan felt nothing. She opened her eyes, and they were surrounded by the smoke. Everywhere they looked, from all sides, nothing was there. It was like looking out into a blank computer screen, but they were surrounded by it. The smoke was making contact with their skin now, but they stayed put, and they could still all be seen by one another. They were the only things left, however. The small shiny particles of the gray cloud pulled upwards on their arm hairs. Cleo looked up from her position on the ground and saw there was a clearing directly above them, a perfect circle where the smoke did not touch. The firefighter walked up to the policeman after they had gotten the fire under control. Officer Colby was looking up at the blackened apartment building with his notepad out, ready to get the information for the report. "It's a tragedy, really. 4 of them died tonight," said the firefighter. "All of them under 18. The firefighters were surrounding the building and covering the ones who got out in time. To the right of Officer Colby was a little girl wrapped in a blanket. She was holding the blanket closed with her Barbie doll in hand. "How did it start?" asked the officer. The firefighter looked down at the little girl. "It started in one of the apartments. We have reason to believe it was a stovetop fire," he replied. "It took down one of the walls between the apartments into a young teen's room. He didn't survive. A woman was telling him earlier that she heard an explosion and she rushed to her son's room, but it was too late. He was then told by a young man that the fire spread from that apartment to his own. His brother and sister were visiting for the weekend and they were caught in the smoke." "May they be in a better place," said the policeman.